Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honour to be back at the Washington Institute, especially at the Weinberg Conference. Barbie Weinberg and I founded the Washington Institute back in 1985. I was absolutely thrilled to see Barbie and Larry here this evening. They are both amazing institution builders, and I was deeply honoured to have the opportunity to work with Barbie, learn from her, and to build this institution. My first hire back then was a guy named Robert Satloff. Look at him now. And I'm also very proud to be up here with him today. I have to say nice things about him because he's going to ask me some questions afterwards. But I'm very proud of Rob and the way that he took over from me when I left the Washington Institute to go into the government back in the opening days of the Clinton administration, and he has done an incredible job ever since in terms of building this institution, making it into such a important and influential think tank in Washington. As I recall, my first conference that we organized was out at the White Plantation for the Washington Institute. And it was small. There was, I guess, only about 30 people. It wasn't called the Weinberg Conference in those days, but Barbie and Larry were there. And a very good friend of the Institute's, Jim Roach, whom some of you, I'm sure, will recall, was there. I think he was working on the Hill at that time as a senior staffer on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Maybe he was the chief of staff. Anyway, after I spoke about the peace process, he came up to me afterwards and said, "What are you going to do when there's peace in the Middle East?" And I said, "Well, there'll always be Cyprus." Little did I know that almost 30 years later, I'd still be trying to make peace in the Middle East. It turns out to be a job that has lousy pay but high job security. Last July, President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry launched a vigorous effort to reach a final status agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. Now it is early May. We've passed the 9-month mark for those negotiations. And for the time being, as is obvious to all, the talks have been suspended. Some have declared the process over. But that is not correct. As my little story testifies, in the Middle East, it's never over. Think back to the spring of 1975, the year the United States brokered the Sinai II disengagement agreement between Israel and Egypt. In March of that year, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger set out to the region to broker that agreement. And after 10 days of shuttling back and forth between Cairo and Jerusalem, the Secretary of State suspended his efforts and returned to Washington empty-handed. The President Ford, and the Secretary announced they would step back. Kissinger vented his frustration. Maybe, he said, a David Ben-Gurion or a Golda Meir could lead Israel to a peace agreement, he fumed, but never a Yitzhak Rabin. We learned a little later just what a peacemaker Yitzhak Rabin turned out to be. Everybody in those days thought it was over. Of course, as we know now, everybody was wrong. A few months later, the talks were restarted, and soon thereafter, a deal was reached. What was true then is also possibly true today. The process is always difficult, but it is never impossible. But in certain ways, things were more difficult in Kissinger's day, and in some ways, they were easier. Since this audience appreciates Middle Eastern history, I think it's interesting to take stock of what has changed and what has stayed the same since Henry's time. In some ways, things are easier in the Israeli-Palestinian context today than in the past. The international context is certainly better. The Cold War and fear that a conflict in the Middle East would trigger a nuclear superpower confrontation is long gone. The region has not faced an all-out Arab-Israeli war for 40 years. Peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan have held today despite very difficult circumstances. 2 intifadas, conflicts with Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, and of course, the Arab revolutions. Turmoil in the Middle East is bringing Israelis and Arab states closer together. Indeed, there is a virtual realignment taking place between the enemies of moderation on the one side and the proponents of moderation on the other that crosses the Arab-Israeli divide. As Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has noted, and I quote, "Many Arab leaders today already realize that Israel is not their enemy, that peace with the Palestinians would turn our relations with them and with many Arab countries into open and thriving relationships." In the Israeli-Palestinian domestic arena, there is in some ways greater political realism than before. Back in Kissinger's day, Golda Meir said there was no such thing as a Palestinian people. Now a Likud Prime Minister says there has to be 2 states for 2 peoples. Back then, Yasser Arafat was committed to Israel's destruction. Today, his successor, Abu Mazen, is committed to living alongside Israel in peace. The US-Israel relationship has also changed in quite dramatic ways. Only those who know it from the inside, as I have had the privilege to do, can testify to how deep and strong are the ties that now bind our 2 nations. When President Obama speaks with justifiable pride about those bonds as unbreakable, he means what he says and he knows of what he speaks. Unlike the reassessment that Henry Kissinger undertook in the Ford administration after that breakdown in negotiations, in this case, the reassessment that we are now undertaking has one significant difference. President Obama and Secretary Kerry would never suspend US-Israel military relations as their predecessors did back then. Those military relations are too important to both our nations. However, in many respects, when it comes to peace negotiations, things have proven to be much harder today than in the 1970s. Henry Kissinger faced Israelis and Egyptians who were coming off the painful 1973 war. I was an Australian student in Israel at that time. I remember well the sense of existential dread in the country brought on by the scope of Israeli casualties. And I remember also a willingness to consider withdrawals from the Sinai that had previously been ruled out. Few of you probably remember how Moshe Dayan, then Defense Minister, stated proudly before the 1973 Yom Kippur War that he would rather have Sharm el-Sheikh than peace. Egypt also had a sense of urgency, generated by Sadat's belief that only peace with Israel could change Egypt's dire economic circumstances, and only US diplomacy could achieve that peace. Yet where is the sense of urgency today? To be absolutely clear, I am not for a moment suggesting that violence is necessary to produce urgency and flexibility. That is abhorrent. We are indeed very fortunate to have two leaders in President Abbas and Prime Minister Netanyahu who are committed to achieving a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through peaceful means. But one problem that revealed itself in these past 9 months is that the parties, although both showing some flexibility in the negotiations, do not feel the pressing need to make the gut-wrenching compromises necessary to achieve peace. It is easier for the Palestinians to sign conventions and appeal to international bodies in their supposed pursuit of justice and their rights, a process which by definition requires no compromise. It is easier for Israeli politicians to avoid tension in the governing coalition and for the Israeli people to maintain the current comfortable status quo. It is safe to say that if we, the United States, are the only party that has a sense of urgency, these negotiations will not succeed. Kissinger also had the advantage of being able to pursue peace incrementally, what he labelled the step-by-step approach. He told me recently that he introduced that idea because after the trauma of the Yom Kippur War, he feared that Israeli society would not be able to handle the big jump to a total withdrawal from Sinai. It took 6 years from war to peace on the Israeli-Egyptian front. On the Israeli-Palestinian front, the Oslo Accords provided for an interim process that was supposed to last 5 years. It has now been 20 years since Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat shook hands on the White House lawn. Since then, thousands of Israelis and Palestinians have died, and the interim process is now thoroughly stuck, with further redeployments and roadmaps turned into roadkill along the way. An interim period that was designed to build trust has in fact exacerbated mistrust. Suicide bombings, the Second Intifada, continuous settlement growth have led many people on both sides to lose faith. This is why Secretary Kerry, with the full backing of President Obama, decided to try this time around for a conflict-ending agreement. There are other differences too. Egypt is a state with a 5,000-year history capable of living up to its commitments, even during revolution. The Palestinians are just now in the process of building their state. And given the bitter experience of the Second Intifada and the consequences of the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, Israelis don't trust them to live up to any of their commitments. Even now, after a serious US-led endeavour to build credible Palestinian security services, after 7 years of security cooperation that the Israel Defense Forces and the Shin Bet now highly appreciate, and after Abu Mazen's efforts to promote non-violence in the face of pressure from Palestinian extremists, the fundamental mistrust remains. The geographic context is different too. The Sinai Peninsula is a 200-kilometre buffer zone between Israel and Egypt. Israelis and Palestinians, on the other hand, live virtually on top of each other. Moreover, the geographic issues are at the heart of what it means to be a Palestinian or an Israeli. The core issues of land, refugees, Jerusalem have defined both peoples for a very long time. It is part of their identity in a way that the Sinai Desert was not. Now, as back in 1975, we face a breakdown in the talks, with both sides trying to put the blame on the other party. The fact is, both the Israelis and Palestinians missed opportunities and took steps that undermined the process. We have spoken publicly about unhelpful Israeli steps that combined to undermine the negotiations. But it is important to be clear. We view steps the Palestinians took during the negotiations as unhelpful too. Signing accession letters to 15 international treaties at the very moment when we were attempting to secure the release of the fourth tranche of prisoners was particularly counterproductive. And the final step that led to the suspension of the negotiations at the end of April was the announcement of a Fatah-Hamas reconciliation agreement, which came while we were working intensively on an effort to extend the negotiations. But it is much more important to focus on where we go from here. And it is critical that both sides now refrain from taking steps that could lead to an escalation and a dangerous spiral that could easily get out of control. Thus far, since the negotiations were suspended, they have both shown restraint, and it is essential that this continue. We've also spoken about the impact of settlement activity. Just during the past 9 months of negotiations, tenders for building 4,800 units were announced, and planning was advanced for another 8,000 units. It's true that most of the tendered units are slated to be built in areas that even Palestinian maps in the past have indicated would be part of Israel. Yet the planning units were largely outside that area in the West Bank. And from the Palestinian experience, there is no distinction between planning and building. Indeed, according to the Israeli Bureau of Census and Statistics, from 2012 to 2013, construction starts in West Bank settlements more than doubled. That's why Secretary Kerry believes it is essential to delineate the borders and establish the security arrangements in parallel with all the other permanent status issues. In that way, once a border is agreed, each party would be free to build as it liked in its own state. I also worry about a more subtle threat that settlement activity poses to the character of the Jewish state. Prime Minister Netanyahu himself has made clear the fundamental purpose of these negotiations is to ensure that Israel remains a Jewish and democratic state, not a de facto binational state. The settlement movement, on the other hand, may well drive Israel into an irreversible binational reality. If you care about Israel's future, as I know so many of you do, and as I do, you should understand that rampant settlement activity, especially in the midst of negotiations, doesn't just undermine Palestinian trust in the purpose of the negotiations, it can undermine Israel's Jewish future. If this continues, it could mortally wound the idea of Israel as a Jewish state, and that would be a tragedy of historic proportions. Public opinion was another element that we found very challenging over the past 9 months. Henry Kissinger focused very little on this element, because while the Israelis and Egyptians fought wars with each other, their societies were not physically intertwined. The peace between two states mediated by Dr. Kissinger was not psychologically difficult either. Israelis and Palestinians, by contrast, are both physically intertwined and psychologically separated, and terrorism and occupation have added to the trauma between the peoples, making everything harder. Consistently over the last decade, polling on both sides reveals majority support for the two-state solution. But, as many of you know, neither side believes the other side wants it, and neither seems to understand the concerns of the other. For example, Palestinians do not comprehend the negative impact of their incitement on the attitudes of Israelis. When Palestinians who murdered Israeli women and children are greeted as heroes in celebration of their release, Who can blame the Israeli public, parents who lost children and children who lost parents, for feeling despair and anger? On the other side, Palestinians feel that Israelis don't even see their suffering anymore, thanks to the success of the security barrier and the security cooperation. One Palestinian negotiator told his Israeli counterparts in one of our sessions, "You just don't see us. We are like ghosts to you." Israelis don't seem to appreciate the highly negative impact on the Palestinian public of the Israeli army's demolition of Palestinian homes or military operations in populated Palestinian towns that are supposed to be the sole security responsibility of the Palestinian Authority, or the perceived double standard applied to settlers involved in price tag attacks. Palestinians cannot imagine how offended and suspicious Israelis become when they call Jews only a religion and not a people. Israelis cannot understand why it took a Palestinian leader 65 years to acknowledge the enormity of the Holocaust. Palestinians cannot understand why their leaders should have been denigrated rather than applauded for now doing so. And the list goes on and on. The upshot of these competing narratives, grievances, and insensitivities is that they have badly affected the environment for negotiations. While serious efforts were underway behind closed doors, we tried to get the leaders and their spokesmen to engage in synchronized positive messaging to their publics. Instead, Prime Minister Netanyahu was understandably infuriated by the outrageous claims of Saeb Erekat, the Palestinian chief negotiator, no less, that the Prime Minister was plotting the assassination of the Palestinian president. And Abu Mazen was humiliated by false Israeli claims that he had agreed to increase settlement activity in return for the release of prisoners. So why then, in the face of all of this, do I still believe that direct negotiations can deliver peace? Because over the last 9 months, behind the closed doors of the negotiating rooms, I've witnessed Israelis and Palestinians engaging in serious and intensive negotiations. I've seen Prime Minister Netanyahu straining against his deeply held beliefs to find ways to meet Palestinian requirements. I've seen Abu Mazen ready to put his state security in American hands to overcome Israeli distrust of Palestinian intentions. I've seen moments where both sides have been unwilling to walk in each other's shoes. But I've also witnessed moments of recognition by both sides of what is necessary. I've seen moments when both sides talked past each other without being able to recognize it. But I have also seen moments of genuine camaraderie and engagement in a common effort to try to find solutions to these vexing challenges. The reality is that aside from Camp David and Annapolis, serious permanent status talks have been a rarity since the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993. For all of its flaws, this makes the past 9 months important. In 20 rounds of negotiations over the first 6 months, we managed to define clearly the gaps that separate the parties on all of the core issues. And since then, we have conducted intensive negotiations with the leaders and their teams to try to bridge those gaps. Under the leadership of General Allen, we have done unprecedented work to determine how best to meet Israel's security requirements in the context of a two-state solution, which Secretary Kerry has emphasized from day one is absolutely essential to any meaningful resolution of this conflict. As a result, we are all now better informed about what it will take to achieve a permanent status agreement. One thing that will never change, and is as true today as it was during Kissinger's time, is that peace is always worth pursuing, no matter how difficult the path. Indeed, until the very last minute, it may seem impossible, as it did in Kissinger's day. The cynics and the critics will sit on the sidelines and jeer. They will say, "I told you so." They're doing it already. They will even claim that the United States is disengaging from the world, even as we have been so deeply engaged in this issue that matters so much to so many of our partners around the globe. But we will make no apologies for pursuing the goal of peace. Secretary Kerry certainly won't, and President Obama certainly won't. To quote Secretary Kerry, "The United States has a responsibility to lead, not to find the pessimism and negativity that's so easily prevalent in the world today." And the benefits are just too important to let go. For Palestinians, a sovereign state of their own, a dignified future, of freedom, a just solution for the refugees. For Israelis, a more secure, Jewish and democratic homeland, an opportunity to tap into the potential for strategic alliances and deep economic relations with its Arab neighbors in the region. For all of us, and more importantly, for all of the children of Abraham, an opportunity for a more prosperous, peaceful, and secure future. Whether we get there or not now, however, ultimately comes down to leadership. After a 5-month pause, Kissinger was able to resume the negotiations with Rabin and Sadat and bring them to a successful Sinai II disengagement agreement, because Rabin was eventually capable of overcoming his political constraints, and Sadat was prepared to make positive gestures that made it possible for Rabin to do so. As Dr. Kissinger noted, the task of the leader is to get his people from where they are to where they have not been before. Let's hope it won't take a 5-month pause this time. Let's hope that President Abbas and Prime Minister Netanyahu are able to overcome the hurdles that now lie on that path back to the negotiating table. When they are ready, they will certainly find in Secretary Kerry and President Obama willing partners in that effort to try again, if they are prepared to do so in a serious way. The obvious truth is that neither Israelis nor Palestinians are going away. They must find a way to live together in peace, respecting each other, side by side, in 2 independent states. There is no other solution. The United States stands ready to assist in this task, to help the leaders take their people to where they have never been, but where they still dream of going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. That was an extraordinary speech. I look forward to going over it in microscopic detail. But really, in all seriousness, I thank you so much for everything that went into that speech, and if I can just add, if I can thank you for the many months, and really it's years and decades, of your commitment to this amazing goal, a goal I think every person in this room shares, but you have worked so hard to take from a goal into reality, a goal of a truly secure and lasting peace. So thank you. Martin and I had a chat the other day about what I get to do right now, and I get to ask Martin 3 questions. So I should say at the outset what I'm not going to waste my questions on. I'm not going to waste my questions on how soon Martin goes back to Brookings, as been reported by the Israeli press. I'm not going to ask my questions on...
They knew before I did.
There you go. I'm not going to ask some of the fascinating historical questions which emerge from this account, such as how we should look at the difference in the strategic environment between 1975, when the pursuit of Egypt-Israel peace was a key player in the global confrontation, whereas what role, if any, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict plays in global politics today. I'm going to focus on a couple of items.
I can answer that one.
Okay, but that doesn't count as one. I do want to begin with the following. Martin, you mentioned competing narratives, and you also went into some great detail about the question of settlements. Now, recently, in the Israeli media, there was a detailed op-ed by a certain journalist which quoted an unnamed American diplomat as going into great detail about how the settlement activity was the principal reason on which the impasse in negotiations ended. And then there are others who offer a different narrative, which goes something like this, that in fact, the real complaint that one should have about Prime Minister Netanyahu and settlement activity is not so much that it was rampant, but that he didn't take public credit for how little there was, and that he was essentially not feeding his hard right by having settlement activity in Jerusalem and its environs, but that he wasn't feeding the hard right, but never publicly took credit for it, and therefore didn't isolate the hard right. So these are two very different narratives at looking at settlement activity. One, that it was rampant and that it fed all the worst fears among Palestinians and therefore undermined the credibility of the negotiations. And on the other hand, that it was actually quite limited, but Netanyahu didn't take public credit for limiting it, and therefore there wasn't that psychological shift that was so important to peacemaking. Which is it?
Well, I'd never agree with a senior unnamed American official. Should I say agree or disagree?
You said agree.
Agree, yeah. No, I'd never disagree, man. Freudian slip. I've not heard of this second account. Doesn't make any sense to me. And I honestly don't understand what it means. Maybe somebody else can explain it to me. What I do know is that in the midst of negotiations, these settlement announcements, not so much of the tenders, but the combination of tenders and planning, said 8,000 planning units were announced, and coming as each tranche of prisoners were released, had a dramatically damaging impact on the negotiations. You see, Abu Mazen, I think, came into these negotiations skeptical after 20 years since Oslo. And the impact that settlement activity had since then, I think some additional 200,000 settlers in the West Bank since 1993, since the signing of the Oslo Accords. That settlement activity became a kind of litmus test. Now, he had wanted a construction freeze before negotiations started. But Prime Minister Netanyahu, given the makeup of his government, with the right-wing parties in it, could not deliver on that. And the Prime Minister chose instead to release these prisoners. But Abu Mazen did not expect that it would be accompanied in this way by these announcements of thousands of settlements. And as I said in my speech, the argument that was made publicly, repeatedly, by Israeli leaders that he had agreed to the settlement activity in exchange for the prisoner releases. In other words, he had purchased the prisoner releases by agreeing to more settlement activity in the territory that he considered was supposed to be for the Palestinian state that he was negotiating for. That was a humiliation for him. And I witnessed it. I witnessed the way that he shut down. It wasn't the only reason he shut down, but it was the major reason that he shut down towards the end of last year. So I don't know what this other narrative is, but I can tell you firsthand that that had a very damaging effect. And by the way, it was intended to have that damaging effect. The promoters of the settlement activity were the ones who were adamantly opposed to the negotiations, even though they were in a government that was committed to the negotiations. And it was that determination to use settlement activity as a way of sabotaging the negotiations that succeeded. And that is a real problem. Now Abu Mazen says, we're going to resume the negotiations. There has to be a construction freeze, not just in the West Bank, but also in Jerusalem. He says for 3 months, so that during that time, the negotiators can draw the map, and then Israel can build wherever it wants on its side of the border. Of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu can no more do a 3 months construction freeze in the West Bank and East Jerusalem than he could before we started the negotiations in the run-up to that, because that would collapse his government. And there's no prime minister that I know anywhere that is willing to sacrifice his government. So it's not just that it sabotaged the negotiations, but it's also a roadblock, one of the roadblocks now, to the resumption of negotiations. So we can rationalize it, we can explain it away, we can argue that they're all, they're going to be evacuated, or 80% of settlers are going to be accommodated as part of the deal, which is probably true. But in the meantime, the building of settlements, expansion of settlements on land that the Palestinians believe is supposed to be part of their state, and the prevention of their ability to build in the same land is a very problematic situation in terms of trying to resolve this conflict.
Let me ask you, Martin, about one item on the agenda, which wasn't on the agenda back in 1975, but which was a major item on the agenda between Israelis and Palestinians today, and it didn't come up in your remarks at all. And that's the Israeli request that Palestinians recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. Now, this is terminology that American officials from presidents on down have endorsed and used. Is it legitimate for Israel? Was it legitimate? Is it legitimate for Israel to put this on the agenda and to view it as a key item, a key desiderata, a key item that it wants from the Palestinians within the package of items that get traded in the give and take of negotiations?
In the view of the Obama administration, it is totally legitimate. By the way, it's legitimate for either side to bring issues to the table that are important to them. And from our point of view, from the American point of view, it's kind of self-evident that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. It's never been an issue in our own policy, and President Obama has made it absolutely clear that from the American point of view, from his point of view, there needs to be that kind of mutual recognition. When it was first introduced, and you probably remember this, Rob, actually by Tzipi Livni, who is very dedicated to trying to achieve a two-state solution. when she was negotiating in the Olmert government with Abu Allah. And when she first put it on the table, Abu Allah said, this is a new requirement. We reject it. But he was a very canny negotiator, and I think he saw it as suddenly a new card that Israel was giving him in his pocket. If it's so important to Israel that they need recognition of its nature as a Jewish state, as opposed to recognition of Israel's right to exist, which the PLO had already done back in 1993, he thought, well, okay, if they care about this so much, I'll get something for it. I believe that was his attitude. And we proceeded on the assumption that the resistance to this on the Palestinian side was tactical. There were objections, strong objections, that Abu Mazen voiced to it. Number one, he said, this is a new requirement. It was never a core issue in the Israel-Egypt peace treaty, in the Israel-Jordan peace treaty, or in the Oslo Accords. We were required to recognize Israel's right to exist, not Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. So that was his first objection. Second objection was that to call it a Jewish state is to deny the rights of Israel's non-Jewish citizens. The third objection was that it would somehow undermine the argument of Palestinian refugees for a right of return. And the fourth argument was that it would require the Palestinians to accept the Zionist narrative. So in the negotiations, we tried to address all of those concerns. But the more we tried to address them, the more he seemed to dig in. And the more that the Israeli government made it an issue and raised it to a more and more supreme issue, I think the more that Palestinians began to think there's something going on here. It's part of the pathology of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, that what one side wants, the other side naturally denies. It's, so it ended up becoming a major roadblock. And I think there is a way of resolving it. I believe that once the Palestinians come to understand what their state will look like and when they will get it, that this issue will become much less important and solvable. But I do not believe, and by the way, I do not think that Prime Minister Netanyahu insists that it be a precondition or that it have to be resolved first. The concept of all of these issues being dealt with in parallel is accepted by both sides. So hopefully there's a way of reconciling the demands and concerns of the two sides on this issue. But I have to tell you, at the moment, the gap on this issue is very wide. Prime Minister Netanyahu says it's foundational, and Abu Mazen says, I won't even discuss it.
Martin, let me ask a question about the American role. There was an evolution over the last 9 months in terms of what the American side hoped to achieve, agreements, understandings, and eventually it became an effort by Israelis and Palestinians to win over America in the blame game, as you said, as you implied. At what point, if any, do you say in your parting memo to the Secretary, next time we do it differently? Next time it's not about us, next time we're less of a partner or less of a fixture in negotiations, rather. We have to find a way to make it more about them. And then how would you go about doing it to make the negotiations more about Israelis and Palestinians negotiating with each other than each side negotiating with you?
Well, first of all, as I said in my remarks, the first 6 months were the two sides negotiating with each other. I was in the room for much of those negotiations, but I was a silent observer, and we did not interfere in that negotiation at all, except occasionally to clarify things or to get them to set the next date for the negotiations, which always seem to be a negotiation in itself. And as I said, those 6 months, all of the core issues were discussed. And it was possible to essentially delineate where the gaps were on all of those core issues. At that point, it became natural for the United States to step in and start to work with both sides to try to develop bridging ideas that would close the gaps. And that's when we moved from direct negotiation to 2 months of negotiations between the US and Israel, and then the US and the Palestinians. The first part of that was negotiating with the Israelis. And that was a very intensive negotiation. It wasn't visible. There were tens of hours, maybe even hundreds of hours, I didn't count them up, of telephone calls between the Secretary and the Prime Minister. There were secure video conferences. And that was a very intensive negotiation in which the Prime Minister, and I described how difficult, visibly difficult it was for him, but he moved. He showed flexibility. We had him, I think, by the end of that process, in the zone of a possible agreement. The Palestinians were, for that time period, quite content to sit back and enjoy the show. It was a kind of spectator sport. The Defense Minister of Israel was insulting the Secretary of State, and our ideas on security, yeah, it wasn't actually a laughing matter from our point of view. But it was clear that there was a good deal of tension between the US and Israel, and they were content for that time. But during that time, and I can't say that I fully comprehend all of the factors involved, but during that time, Abu Mazen shut down. As I said, settlement activity was a big factor in it. I think rivalry over the succession was also a big factor. He's 79 now, he's weary, he wants to leave office, and he's more focused on succession now than on making peace. I think he came to the conclusion that he didn't have a reliable partner for the kind of two-state solution that he was looking for. And he kind of shifted to his legacy and the succession. And that reminded me, you'll appreciate this for a little bit of a history excursion, if you'll allow me, since this was your last question. Right.
But you haven't answered it yet.
That's what US government officials do, Ron. Not answer questions. You'll recall, and has Ehud Barak left? He'll recall. He's not here. Yeah. Oh, phew. But he'll recall that Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, was coming to the end of his time in office, basically the end of his life, and he was looking to make peace with Israel. At that moment, at the end of 1999, he decided he wanted to move after playing around with us for 8 years. And suddenly he said, I want to do it, I want to make peace, and I want to do it quickly. And he sent his foreign minister to negotiate with then Prime Minister Ehud Barak in Blair House and in Shepherdstown. And the details of the text that we were negotiating was then leaked to Haaretz, embarrassed and humiliated Assad, especially because it didn't have anything about the one demand that he had made, which was the 67 lines. And he shut down, so that when we came with Prime Minister Barak's map of the line of withdrawal, which is essentially the 67 lines, except for a little narrow strip around the northeast quadrant of the Sea of Galilee, he shut down, and he did not answer us, other than saying, no, he's not interested. And, you know, we puzzled for a long time about what happened there, as we puzzle today about what happened with Abu Mazen. But the fact is, when he came to Washington in mid-March, and we put ideas on the table, by that point, he wasn't willing to respond. And, you know, the response we got was essentially in the Arab League summit in Kuwait, in which he said he would never discuss the Jewish state, but didn't relate to any of the other issues. So it's like, you know, there were ships passing in the night. Abu Mazen was flexible and was engaged in the first 6 months when the secretary was involved with him, looking for ways to meet Israel's security requirements, which were the key thing that we were working on in that time. But by the time we got to back to him, other things had intervened, and he'd moved on to the succession, which is what he's focused on today. The Hamas-Fatah reconciliation is not about making a deal with Hamas. It's about elections, because he wants presidential elections. He can't resign now because the head of the PLC would become the president. And the head of the PLC is a Hamas representative. So he wants elections so that he can hand over to a elected president who presumably will not be Hamas. Well, that's his assumption. And that's where he's now focused. He will come back to negotiations if his test of seriousness is met, as I explained it to you. Construction freeze in the West Bank and East Jerusalem for 3 months while the border is drawn. Because that, if an Israeli government is prepared to do that, then from his point of view, that's a serious negotiation. Other than that, he's not interested. He's focused on succession instead, and his legacy. And he would rather go out as a leader who did not compromise on Palestinian rights than a leader that made a deal that didn't meet Palestinian requirements. So I know what I didn't answer your question is, will there be more direct negotiations than we had? Yeah, but it was kind of not an issue. We had direct negotiations, then we had bilateral US-Israel and US-Palestinian negotiations. Then we came back at the end to direct negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians. And there are times in which it's appropriate and times when it's better for the United States to be engaged with each side. And I think that both sides in the end were not unhappy with the way in which that was handled. There were occasions when they said it's better if we deal directly, and we said go ahead. And we'd be quite happy for them to deal directly with each other now, and we'll play a facilitating role. So I just think it depends on the dynamic of the negotiation.
Friends, we could go on with this seminar on Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy because there really is very few people that could do this seminar with any more experience or insight than Martin. But we've exhausted my 3 questions. So please join me in thanking Ambassador Martin Indyk, for joining us this evening.